All right. I'm ready for some speedrunning. We are 53 points away from the conclusion of the speedrun. Let's cut into that. And let's play. I want to try to play more in a boa constrictor. Okay, 2182, very, very strong opponent. And well, let's play Sicilian. Let's see how Accelerated Dragon will hold up at this level. If you guys remember, in the 5-minute speedrun, I played almost exclusively the Accelerated Dragon, and I want to see how it holds up at this level. Let's see whether people have found the reputation. Bishop e2. Okay, so this is a peaceful line. It's not particularly bad, but it allows black to equalize. There is a very specific reason why white usually puts the bishop on c4 in the accelerated, and it's to stop me from playing d5. Here we essentially exploit the drawback of that move by playing d5. And generally in the accelerated, if you can play d5 in a good, in a good version, then you solve all of your opening problems. Black breaks through, all our pieces are active, black is equal here. Now, white is not worse if white plays accurately, but if white's not accurate, he can end up being worse here. Yeah, this is well-known theory. Knight takes d5. Knight takes c6, bc. Okay, now bishop d4 I think is one move. And it's equal. Yeah, this is drawish. So we're going to have to manufacture winning chances here. Okay, bishop d4. So there's a couple of options here. As far as I remember, if I'm remembering my theory right, let me try to remember actually. So one option is to play knight takes c3 and force white to take with a pawn and ruin white's queenside pawn structure. But then both of our pawn structures are going to be ruined. But I think that a more circumspect option is to do something very unexpected. I mean, you guys are not expecting me to say this. It's something... See, at this level, some of this stuff you kind of just have to know. So what I'm about to do is a great example of a line which I remember seeing somewhere, but I probably wouldn't have even been able to figure it out myself if I didn't know about it. Or actually, wait, takes... So the idea is to play bishop takes d4, queen takes d4, and then queen b6. And essentially try to force a queen trade on my terms so I can correct my pawn structure. I mean, that may lead to a draw, to a bunch of trades and a draw, though. That's the drawback. Yeah, so, maybe we can actually play knight takes c3, because this creates a little bit more imbalance in the position, and it's a simpler move. So I'm going to say bishop takes d4 for later. Let's play knight takes c3. Okay, bishop takes c3. Okay, so he also wants to trade bishops. That's fine with me. That's fine by me. Obviously, we need to take that bishop in order to ruin white's pawn structure. Okay, and this is not a good move because he's giving us the d-file. He's playing for a draw. Okay, now let's try to devise a strategy by which we're going to play for a win in this endgame. A couple of moves immediately come to mind. The first move, I'm sure you guys probably are tempted by this move, is rook to d2. But rook to d2 is not as effective as it looks, I think, because of bishop d3, and then the rook is kind of trapped there. So instead, I think we should go for the second tempting move, which is bishop f5, developing with tempo. Why not, right? Hitting the pawn on c2. And what may happen is we get some position of pawn up. Okay, now, the key question is, should we take on c2, or should we make some other move? Should we take on c2 here? So we need to calculate, and it's quite easy to calculate. Bishop takes c2, bishop takes c6, and then rook a to c8, skewering the bishop and the pawn. We absolutely should take. There is no reason not to. Another byproduct of taking on c2 is that he can't put a rook on b1 anymore, and he can't put a rook on d1 anymore either. So that bishop is actually extremely good. And If he goes rook c1, I think he might go rook fc1. Goes rook f e1. We want to protect that bishop at all costs unless he chases it away in the right way. Okay, so obviously here we should play e6 and protect the pawn. We could have also gone king f8. I don't know. Maybe king f8 was marginally better. It doesn't really matter. Well, rook d2 would be premature because our e7 pawn was hanging. Right? Our pawn was hanging, so we do need to defend this pawn. Well, I don't know why we would play rook ac8 here when we can just ignore this pawn and take white's pawn. There's no point in defending c6. It's already defended indirectly with this idea, rook ac8 and then rook takes c3. And we're going to be a pawn up in the endgame. Yeah, so many dark square weaknesses and so many pieces that he can exploit them with. Okay, so we're going to take on c3 against every move except bishop e4. Then we're going to take the bishop first. Okay, so in such positions at this level, you never want to play a move automatically, right? You always want to be aware of, various intermezzos, and maybe we want to go rook c7 first. In this particular instance, I don't really see the point of going rook c7 first. But in general, you have to be aware of such intermediate moves. Don't ever take a piece automatically. Okay, so this is his big idea. This is his big idea. He is trying to create a pin against our rook. And then he's going to try to pick this bishop off by playing probably rook e2 and bishop e4 at center. So here we need to think logically and find a way to extricate this bishop. But to extricate this bishop, what does that mean? That probably means finding a way to reinforce the rook on c3. The real problem here isn't the bishop, it's the fact that the rook on c3 is undefended. If it was defended, we would be able to move the bishop wherever we wanted. So what is the most efficient and the safest way of defending that bishop? It's to play rook to d7. Thank you. Don't swap me, please. And Jeff Gross Poker with a raid. Already have 60. Thank you. Rook d7 to c7, yeah. I actually think that's even better than rook d2. Because what is the issue with the rook d2? The issue with the rook d2 is that it doesn't actually protect the rook on c3. I think it is safer to play rook d7 and then rook c7, and then we will for sure be able to move our bishop. Does that make sense? Rook d2 is also a great move. Maybe even objectively rook d2 is better, but I don't want to deal with a headache of this rook being unprotected. Thank you, Jeff. Appreciate it. I hope I'm making sense. When you are trying to solve a pin or take the sting out of a pin, the best thing to do is either to move the piece that's pinned. That's not an option here. The second best thing is to reinforce the piece that's pinned. Thank you, dot/fork for the prime. Well, bishop e4, rook d c7, that's the whole point. You should see this. That's the whole point of our last move, guys. If you were following my logic, you would understand that now we're defending the bishop with two separate rooks. And white is in huge trouble. Bishop f3. So that's a good move. I think he's at least trying to keep pieces on the board. Okay. So let's figure out where we want to move this bishop, because we want to be as accurate as possible. So where do you guys think we should remove this bishop to? Should we go this diagonal? Should we go here? There is a certain logic, I think, to the correct move here. You guys are on top of your game. Bishop a4, exactly. I'm impressed. And the idea here is to stop the rook from coming to d1. We want to prevent our opponent from occupying important open files. This bishop is also quite invulnerable. If we had gone to f5, maybe he would have had some g4 ideas later. We don't want to put the bishop on a square where it can be easily attacked. And if you didn't get this move, don't worry. Just make sure you're understanding the logic. Now, I want to make it clear that it's not like bishop f5 is a terrible move. We're not talking here about big mistakes. We're talking about small subtleties that together form the basis for really good endgame play. None of this is a life or death decision, not even rook dc8. I hope that's clear. And you shouldn't think of this as like, I didn't see one move, therefore I suck. This is pretty difficult stuff. Truly, it's not easy to generate this kind of logic. Okay. So takes, I pre-moved rook takes c3. Okay, keep the questions for after the game. h3. Now, what should we do here? What should be the next stage of our plan? Next stage of our plan should be to identify white's biggest weakness and then immediately attack it. Now, there is an important subtlety here. There's rook c2. That's one way to attack the pawn. But very often, these frontal attacks are even stronger. Rook to a3, in my opinion, is even better. Why is rook a3 better than rook c2? Well, there is a tactical component to this, and then a positional component. The positional component is that attacking a pawn while blockading it immobilizes the pawn. If you go rook c2, he can go a3. And then we're going to have to keep pursuing a moving target. As you know, pursuing a moving target is harder. So here, we pursue a stationary target. The tactical reasoning here is that rook e2, which would seem to be a pretty nice way to defend the pawn, actually fails to the move bishop to d1, which I know a lot of you guys saw, winning at least the second pawn. And so if white goes rook a1, then it's our turn to use a pin against white. We play bishop b3. We pick off the second pawn, and the rest is a matter of pretty straightforward technique. We just start pushing our passer. Rubinstein, Akiba Rubinstein, was really one of the first people to, I think, show this idea of fronting a pawn and attacking it while blockading it. Thank you, /4, for the 200 bits. Yeah, Rubinstein had some very famous games where he did this, particularly also against Lasker. As he's thinking, I'm going to try to pull that game up. If you want to learn proper endgame play, you should definitely consider reviewing Rubinstein's games. Moment. Yeah, I found the game. So after we finish this game, I will show you the Rubinstein game where I kind of really got inspired, where I kind of understood the importance of blockading with a rook. Okay, rook e2, and there comes bishop d1. This is the crushing move. Okay, rook e2, then bishop d1. This is a skewer. If he goes rook e3, then obviously we trade everything and we're a pawn up in a pawn endgame. That doesn't even need to be calculated. That's obviously winning. But, you know. Oh my god! Oh my god! What? Woo! Oh my god. I cannot believe that. That is 100 by Montana. Woo! Damn, girl. Oh my god. Ridiculous. Man is crazy. Oh my god. Thank you, Montana. You're trying to make me lose on time here. I see what you're trying to do. I really appreciate that. Be incredibly generous at all times. Thank you, Montana, for the 100. Great stuff. All right. Well, we got to win this pawn endgame. Then I'm going to thank you properly. So, one thing that a lot of players struggle with in pawn endgames is the question of where to put the king. Where should we go with the king? And it doesn't actually really matter. We can go this way, but there is, I think, a much better pathway for the king. So one really good way of approaching these kinds of endgames is to start by identifying your opponent's biggest weaknesses. So really take a deep dive into white's pawn structure. Now we see that this pawn on h3 is actually isolated, right? So because it's isolated, the ideal scenario is to find a way to tie down white's king to the defense of that pawn. But in order to do that, we have to get our own king into a position where it's contesting that pawn. So the ideal square is h4. If we can get our king to h4, white's king is going to have to stick in the vicinity of g2 and h2, and then we can slowly but surely advance our pawns. You don't need to rush with any pawn moves. He's not going to be able to do anything about our eventual pawn pushes. So the first step is going to be trying to walk the king as close as possible to h4. Now, we're probably not going to get there, but that's okay. We're going to get close enough in order to tie down... we're going to get close enough to tie down white's king permanently. King h6. We are not going toward the center. All right, so I know that the principle dictates that we should go toward the center, but this is an exception to the rule. Here we have a very specific destination. I hope I explained that clearly. Like the logic behind not going toward the center, but going rather toward the H file. It's hard to see that square, but if you follow the logic of identifying isolated and weak pawns, you'll know this idea. So it's all about experience. This is all about experience. And now we sort of slowly but surely advance all of our pawns, being very careful of a couple of things. What do we need to be very careful about as we advance our pawns? Well, the first thing is not to position our pawns in a way where your opponent, for example, what would be bad here is going g5 and e5. Why would that be bad? Because white would play e4, and then we would have a very hard time pushing that f pawn, right? We don't want to create a Swiss cheese situation where we can't make progress despite our extra pawn. So the way that we want to start here, I think, is we don't need to play a5. I mean, we can even let white push a6. It doesn't matter. I don't think he's going to make it all the way here. e5 is a great way to start. f5 would be a Swiss cheese move because white would play f4 and fix the e-pawn, not allow us to play e5. Of course, we would still be winning. We'd be able to play g5, but I'm trying to play as clinically as possible here. So e5, I think, is the best way to start. Then we play f5, g5, etc. If he plays a5, we can play a6 just for fun. We can play a6 just to deplete white's pawn moves and force him essentially to decide. All right, so we're winning here pretty straightforwardly. Okay, so let's think about this for a second. If we play e4, then white is going to go h4, and that's just not something that we want to allow. We want to keep pawns on the board. Let me think. Yeah, so let's go f6. Let's hold the tension by playing f6. Thank you for the 100./fork. I will explain the problem with taking after the game. But what we are trying to do is avoid a situation where we trade off all of the pawns except one pawn. I actually should have played a5, and I will explain this also after the game. There's a lot of stuff to unpack in this endgame. Very instructive, I think. All right, so here, let me think. Takes g5. Takes. Ooh. Let me think. Takes g5. Takes f5. 6. G4. 6. King g6 takes h5. 5. 65 takes 5 b6 there. And takes g5, takes f5, g4, king f6, g3, king takes king g5, takes g5, takes f5, g4, takes in 65. Okay, let's take. Okay, I'm running low on time, but I'll explain my calculations after the game. Don't worry, we're fine. Everything is under control. I think, but I might be wrong also. No, but this is winning. Because now we just walk over to the other side, yeah? We just walk over, we let him take our pawn, And the point is we walk over and take his pawn. But he didn't go for the most testing defense. I will show you what I was actually calculating. All right, very nice. I think my technique could have been a lot better, but it did the trick. Okay. So we're going to skip pretty quickly to the endgame here because I'm pretty tired and I want to focus on the important part here. So bishop e2 is the old move, and the move d5 equalizes. This is one of the drawbacks, by the way, of the accelerated, is that you often get these liquidations. By the way, I forgot. But in this position, you can also play knight b4. This is a viable alternative, and this leads to less of a trading game. So I probably should have done this. Knight b4 and then taking the pawn like this. But okay, I took takes, bishop d4, knight c3, and I think black is better here already. Queen takes d8 is a mistake, giving up the d file for no reason. Thank you, Venice. He should have taken with bc. But, you know, we would have played bishop f5 or bishop e6, and black is a very nice position here. So takes, bc, bishop f5. And already this is extremely nasty for white, right? You guys can ask questions along the way. I know I'm going pretty fast so far. Okay, bishop f3, bishop takes c2. So just to clarify, bishop takes c6, there's rook a c8. I think a lot of people thought that white could play rook c1, force our bishop back, and then take on c6. But that misses an important point. What should black do here? Oh, first of all, there's bishop a4. Bob McGowan, very nice. Bob McGowan, you definitely deserve a sub for that. But I was planning rook d2, which I think is even stronger because it defends the bishop. And after bishop c6, we still have rook c8. We still have rook c8. I'll give you a sub. So rook fe1, e6, bishop c6, rook a c8. I mean, he didn't defend in the best way. He shouldn't have taken this pawn. But obviously, such positions are very hard to defend. So rook d7 is an important point. Rook d7 is an important point. All right. So in this position, we need to protect this rook. So we play rook d7, bishop e4, and rook c7. Bishop f3, and now bishop a4 to cover the d1 square. Takes, h3. Now let me do the first detour. How did I know to play rook f3? Like, where did I learn to do this? Well, the inspiration for this was a Rubinstein game that I remember very clearly. It was one of the more inspiring games that I looked at. Rubinstein against Emanuel Lasker. So you guys can kind of sense the similarity between my game and this game. Both feature this weak pawn on a5, on a7. So what does Rubinstein play here? The first move is forced because his a pawn is hanging. So the first thing is, and also Rubinstein is up a pawn. There's a lot of similarities here. So he goes rook a5. After rook b7, he plays a very instructive move. And he plays it for a different reason than I played it, but it's still very instructive. It's still very instructive. Rook a6, yeah. What is Rubinstein's idea? Well, first of all, he's fixing the pawn. Second of all, he is cutting off the king. This is an important concept in the endgame. Laterally cutting off the king, not letting it get to the center. And now Rubinstein starts very patiently pushing his pawns. e4, h4 to grab some space. g4, bring the king up, and he just grabs space on the king side. Brings the king up, brings the pawn up. He repeats moves to gain time. And now a3, very patient play. And Lasker resigned because the game was adjourned. And this actually leads to Zugzwang for black. The idea of a3 was also to cover the b4 square. No matter where black plays, either white plays e6, or after king f8, white infiltrates with king g6. If black plays rook e7, then white plays e6 check. And the reason Rubinstein didn't go e6 here is because of king e7 blockading the pawn. Thank you, Radcliffe, for the 11 months. Do you guys see what I'm saying? He has to wait for black to occupy that square with his rook. Now e6 is much stronger. You force the king to h7, and then you bring the rook to d7. The rest is easy, and Lasker resigned. So that's how easy it is, and it's all because of that rook on the 6th rank. I know I went quickly through this game, but I think you guys get the point. So this idea is kind of important. Okay, so rook a3. Well, I say damn girl even if it's a boy, so... Oh, you mean inversion? Yeah. No, it's always damn girl. Damn boy doesn't roll off the tongue like that. Okay. So rook a1 and would have been met with the move bishop b3, followed by bishop takes or rook takes a2. Understood? And then we're up 2 pawns and the win is easy. So rook e2, bishop d1. Let's transition to the pawn endgame. So king g7, king h6, king h5. Okay, so in this position, I made what I think is a slight mistake. I think I should have played a5. Now, if you guys want, you know, to extract some lessons in this endgame, then listen very carefully because this is an important point I'm about to make. It is better to fix this pawn as deeply into white's territory as possible. So let me give you an example of why this situation is a lot worse for black than this situation, and it's not because white's king is going to go all the way over here. That's not really a risk because he's not going to make it. But watch what happens. Let's say we follow the game continuation. e5, white plays f4, and let's say for a second that we decide to play this very simply. We just trade all the pawns. How could this go wrong for black? Well, imagine a situation like this. King h3. We think we're winning, we go g5, everything is great. But wait a second, if we took away the a pawns, this would be a draw, right? Because the pawn is on the same file as the king. But very often these positions are winning because we use the pawn as a decoy. And we walk the king over, take the pawn, and then promote the pawn in the time that white takes to take our pawn. But do you guys see why it's bad that this pawn is on a6? Because the problem here is that we have to walk over to our side of the territory, and in the time that we spend taking the pawn, white's king has time to go back to the ideal square. But let's compare even this situation. Let's shift the pawns up to like a3 and a4. That would already be winning, right? If we have the exact same situation, let's imagine for a second that our pawn was on a3. And now we're going to make the exact same moves, This is already winning because we don't have to walk back toward our side of the board. We walk straight to b2, and white does not make it. So the lesson is that if you're anticipating an endgame like this, it is best to fix your opponent's pawn as close as possible to his territory, if practicable. Which is what I didn't do here. I kind of forgot about that, and I allowed him to push his pawn to a5, which didn't spoil anything, but made it a little bit tougher to win. So f4, f6. All right, keeping as many pawns on the board as possible. Now, you might ask, what was I actually calculating here? I was calculating a very specific line. So after e takes f4, e takes f4, g5. Isn't this a draw? Well, no, because I keep my pawn as far away as possible from his king. That is why it is actually counterproductive to push your pawns before trading all of them, because we want our pawn as far away as possible. Why? Because we want it to take as long as possible for white's king to walk up and take the pawn. Does that make sense? We don't want the h pawn to be on h4 right now, because then it would only take one tempo for white to capture it. All right, see, that's why you got to be so careful. What was I calculating? I was calculating the move f5, which actually leads to a very interesting endgame. Because if we try to walk our king out like this, actually this is a draw. Look at this position, king g4, and black is in Zugzwang and has to give up the g5 pawn. This is a draw. So, can anybody tell me what black should do here? I'll give you guys 30 seconds to think about it. What black has an only winning move here, as I just checked with the engine. You have to play g4. But what if white plays king f4? How should black proceed here? This is where the beauty comes. This is what I had to see. Now we play g3. And we distract white's king. We go king g5 and we're winning. The second line, after f6, I had to make sure that white is not able to take the pawn and walk the king back in time. And it's actually really close. So watch. It's actually close. It's literally, if white had one more tempo, he would get it to c2 and it would be a draw. But here we take the opposition and we push the pawn. So it's winning by a single tempo. I had to make sure of that. Welcome to the hell of pawn endgames. So this was not forced. I could have won. I could have won according to the engine by playing the move h6 and then g5 without trading on f4 first. And the reason this is an easier win is because the more pawns you add, the less important it is for us to have the right positioning with our passer, because here we can win simply by giving up the g-pawn for the e-pawn. All right, so that's not hard. It's just, how did I do this calculation? It's easy to visualize these endgames, right? The less pieces there are, the easier it is to visualize. So I'm not going to pretend that this was particularly impressive. This is a pretty standard calculation that you have to do, and I took a while doing it. So in a blitz game, I would have trusted my calculation sooner, but here I doubled and triple checked it. All right, I think it's time for me to call it a day. That basically concluded the game. He did not play in the most testing way. Of course, he played f takes g5, which is an elementary win because now this pawn is really, really far away from the king. So if you're on the defending side of these endgames, you have two main tips. Thank you, Mo Money Gringo. Two main tips for if you're on the defending side of a pawn endgame. The first is, if there's a corner pawn, push your pawn as far as possible into your opponent's territory. It's counterintuitive because it sounds like it's going to be easier for your opponent to capture that pawn, but in reality, that gives your king more time to walk back to your territory. The second tip is to try to lure your opponent into pushing as many of their pawns as possible, which would mean that your king has an easier time taking a pawn if it becomes a decoy. And then you can also review on your own time the game Rubinstein, Lasker, St. Petersburg, 1909 for a very good introduction into these kinds of endgame techniques in the rook endgame. All right, guys. Great game. Thank you for being so engaged. I really appreciate it. It would be a lot more lame if people were not as engaged as they are, so I really appreciate it. I will raid. Who will I raid? I will raid. Let me see. One moment, please. Sorry. Rosen is streaming. Then I will raid Eric. Is he just I am Rosen? I will raid Eric Rosen. All right. I am Rosen, right? Okay. I'll raid Eric, guys. Thank you for hanging out. If you would like more, if you haven't heard enough of my voice, tomorrow at 9 a.m. I will be streaming and commentating on the chess.com channel with Robert Hess. So long. I'll see you guys